Would you stand with us as we begin our worship service and singing? Come into his presence.
With thanksgiving in your heart, and give him praise, and give him praise. Come into his presence with thanksgiving in your heart. Your voice is raised, your voice is raised.
cross I look, and to the cross I cling. Of its suffering I do drink, of its work I do sing. For on it my Savior, both bruised and crushed, show that God is love and God is just. At the cross you beckon me, draw me gently to my knees, and I am lost for words, so lost in love. I am sweetly broken, holy surrender. Yeah. What a priceless gift, undeserved life have I been given through Christ crucified. You call me out of death, you call me into life, and I was under your wrath. Now I'm reconciled. At the cross you beckon me, and draw me gently to my knees, and I am lost for words, so lost in love. I am sweetly broken, holy surrender. And on the cross I must confess, how wondrous your redeeming love, and how great is your faithfulness. At the cross you beckon me, and draw me gently to my knees, and I am lost for words, so lost in love. I am sweetly broken, holy surrender. At the cross you beckon me, and draw me gently to my knees, and I am lost for words, so lost in love. I am sweetly broken, holy surrender.
claps, okay? I like those claps. High up.
Ladies, sing the echo.
Spirit, we love you. We worship and adore you. Glorify thy name in all the earth. Glorify thy name. Glorify thy name. Glorify thy name in all the
You know, the Bible tells us that we're not supposed to be anxious about anything, right? I mean, in the book of Mark, chapter 6, Jesus talks about don't be anxious, don't worry about what you should wear, what clothes you'll have, what food you'll eat, any of that sort of stuff. Hi. He tells us to don't be anxious, right? And so we know that. We're not supposed to worry. We're not supposed to be anxious. And then the Apostle Paul tells us in the book of Philippians, right? Don't be anxious for anything, but pray about everything, right? So we have this idea that we're not supposed to be anxious. We're not supposed to be worried. But yet we have this remedy so that when we do become anxious or we are worried, what we're supposed to do with it. Are you following along with me there? It's like you're not supposed to be, but if you are, then what do you do? And so when it comes to those things, we know how we're supposed to act. Okay, well, I'm not really supposed to worry about whether my kids are going to eat, whether they have the right clothes, any of that sort of stuff, right? We're not supposed to worry about those things, but yet sometimes we do get worried about it. And so we bring those things to the Lord and we trust Him. We say, okay, it's going to be good. You'll take care of it. I'm doing what I can, all of that sort of stuff. But there is something that goes beyond anxiety or worry. And what do you do when what you're concerned about doesn't seem to be getting any better? Right? Have you ever been in that sort of situation? Where it becomes, it's like, well, I know I'm not supposed to worry about this, but yet it's a thing, it's bothering me, it's concerning me. Okay, I'm going to give it to the Lord, but it's not getting any better either. And as that continues to go on, we might reach a place of desperation and say, I have to do something here. And so this morning, as we're going to look into God's Word in Mark chapter 5, I want us to understand that in our times of desperation, if we should find ourselves in any of those times, to turn to God in those times of desperation and depend on Him. Turn to God in your desperation and depend on Him. So turn with me to Mark chapter 5, and we're going to look at two little incidences here that are recorded in the second chapter or second part of Mark chapter 5. We were in Mark chapter 5, the beginning last week, where we talked about Jesus healing the demoniac. And now we're going to move here to the second part of the chapter, starting in verse 21, where Jesus actually heals two different girls, okay? Two different women, if you will. One is 12 years old, and one is a woman who's been suffering with a bleeding condition for 12 years. And the reason I titled the passage or the sermon, Jesus and Two Daughters, because one is the daughter of a religious leader, and one Jesus declares daughter after He heals her. So this is Jesus and Two Daughters, Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 21, going through the end of the chapter. I'm going to read in the English Standard Version, and it will be projected on the screens around me. Follow along if you have your Bibles too, okay? And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about Him, and He was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years old of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. So today's passage, the parallel passages are found in Matthew chapter 9, verses 18 to 26, and Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 56. The parallel passages there, they give these accounts, or this account like this as well. They don't give some of the same details that we have here, but those are the parallel passages, and I will refer to them a little bit, but not much, okay, just to let you know. So here it is. Jesus is continuing to teach on what the kingdom is about, what it means to follow after him in discipleship. And so as he's doing these miracles, he's come to declare the new kingdom, God's redemption, or bringing in back into his control, if you will, creation from the bonds of sin, or the bonds of Satan, if you will. And we saw that last week when Jesus healed the demoniac, and he had done healing like that in Mark chapter 1 earlier too, where he had healed somebody who was possessed with the unclean spirit, the scriptures say. And as we're looking at this, we see that he's committed, or he's performed these miracles in healing people. He calmed the storm there at the end of chapter 4. So it's not just that Jesus is a good teacher. It's not just that he has some power. It's that he has all power. Whatever is necessary, whatever is needed, whatever can be, he can do it. Okay? And so that's part of what he's showing here. But he's also giving us some indication as to what do we do? How are we to walk with God in the midst of life, and the anxieties, the worries, the desperation that sometimes we might find ourselves in. Now, I'm not a person who's gone through a lot of desperation in life. I've gone through situations where I've gotten worried, gone through situations where I've gotten anxious, but there's been very few opportunities or instances in my life where I felt desperate. Okay? People do lots of crazy things when they're desperate. You can look, you see that people who are hooked on drugs or alcohol or something like that, they will do desperate things. They might sell themselves into prostitution to meet their drug deal or drug habit. They might sell their children into those types of situations. That's desperation, right? I don't think too many of us have been that desperate before. Or if we were that desperate, we didn't do that, okay? So I'm not speaking as somebody who says, oh, I'm desperate all the time. Sometimes people act like they're desperate all the time, but they're not, okay? I'm not desperate all the time, but we do find ourselves in times of desperation, okay? I'll get to that a little bit more as we go through this passage. So the idea is in our desperation, we want to turn to God and we want to depend on Him, okay? The first point here is as we're looking at desperation and as we're looking at this passage, desperation, I don't want us to look at desperation as a negative thing necessarily, because if we find ourselves at that point, it is a serious situation. But it's also something that brings about some change or can bring about some change in us as well. So the first point here is desperation can lead us to humility. Okay? Desperation can lead us to humility. Verse 21. So Jesus had gone, last week we talked about, he had left from the northwestern part of the Sea of Galilee and took a boat with his disciples, and they went over to the southeastern, from the northwestern to the southeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee into the region called the Decapolis. And he healed this demoniac there. And so now he's coming back over to the other side. He said to his disciples, let's go to the other side. They were heading over to the other side. A big storm came. Then they got to the other side. Now they're going back to the other side. Okay, so when you say the other side, sometimes you say the other side. It's the other side from where they were last. Okay, so they're going back to Capernaum, or they've come back to Capernaum, and they crossed again in the boat to the other side, it says in verse 21, and a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. And so we see, once again, this situation where Jesus is beside the Sea of Galilee, and there's a bunch of people coming around because they've heard of his fame. He's teaching, they're gathering around, they want to see what he's going to do next. And so as he comes back here, and he's next to the sea, it says in verse 22, then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet. Now, when we think about the synagogue, those are the Jewish people, the Jewish religious people, who are not very welcoming to Jesus. You know, they didn't like what he did. They didn't like the fact that he was healing on the Sabbath day. They thought, well, hey, there's 6 other days in the week. Why do you have to do it on this day? And so they were mad at him. They didn't like the way that he challenged them. They thought, they accused him of being Satan or Beelzebul and doing all of his miracles or casting out demons by the power of Satan, basically. And so they didn't like him. Okay? But here's this person here now. He is a ruler of the synagogue. He's one of the leaders there of that religious body there. And I told you before that a synagogue is a setup because they couldn't go to the temple. Okay? They didn't have the temple there. They would set it up in different places, set up a place of worship in different places. And a synagogue could be established if there were 10 Jewish men there to establish it. Okay? So here it is. This is a house of worship there. And Jairus is his name. And he's one of the rulers there. And when he sees Jesus, it says he fell at his feet. And he implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. So for him to be at this position here, he is desperate. He had been taking care of his daughter, he and his wife, and they're hoping, and I'm sure they're praying like we all do as believers in God. We say, God, can you help me in this situation? And when it comes to a sick child and you find yourself helpless, then we really depend upon God during those times, right? And so he is a person who's been taking care of his daughter and saying, okay, God, you tell me I'm not supposed to. He didn't have Philippians. I'm not saying he did, But the idea is that, okay, I'm supposed to have faith in God. I'm supposed to trust in God. And he and his wife are trusting in God to take care of their daughter, but yet she's getting worse. And so what do you tell them? You're not supposed to worry about it, right? Is that what we would say? Get all scriptural on them and biblically righteous? You're not supposed to worry about that. The Bible says don't worry about it. Not supposed to be anxious about anything. Well, he's desperate. And as a Jewish leader, religious leader, right? He comes, and who knows if he was with the group before? The one that accused Jesus of all these different things, the ones that didn't like him healing on the Sabbath. Maybe he was one of those guys. And now he's coming, he's falling at Jesus' feet, and his desperation, right? He becomes humble. Desperation can lead us to humility. I didn't say it automatically does, because we've probably seen some people who've been desperate who were not humble at all. People who are desperate can be very demanding, right? There's no humility. It's all about me, 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 me when I'm desperate. But this guy is desperate, and it leads him to humility. And so desperation can lead us to humility as well. He sees Jesus, he comes to him, he falls at his feet, and he says, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. And Jesus went with them. And so there is this idea that in the scriptures, it was more a Jewish and pagan tradition of laying hands in terms of healing or helping out to help somebody out that way. But here, if you look in the Old Testament, you don't see a lot of healing that way. In 2 Kings, you see Naaman, who, when the prophet told him, just go and cleanse yourself in the river, he says, oh, I thought he would lay his hands over me or wave his hand over me or something like that. And so there's not a lot of indication there that anyone would need to put their hands on anybody. And we know Jesus really just needs to say the word, right? Agreed or no? Yes, okay. So he just needs to say the word. And so this man says, come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. And so he's asking for Jesus to do this, to heal his daughter, and he is desperate, okay? And in his desperation, he becomes humble. Humble enough to ask. Humble enough to look for Jesus to help him. And so he does this. And so it says, the end of verse, or beginning of verse 24, and it says that Jesus, he went with him. So Jesus went with Jairus. As they're going along the way, they go, and there's a big crowd around them. And as they're going along the way, there's a bunch of people crowding around him, and there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, it tells us in verse 25. So within this crowd is this woman who has had a problem with her, a discharge of blood is the menstruation. She's going through her menstruation period, and it's been sustained for 12 years. And so it tells us here in verse 26 that she had suffered under many physicians, so the doctors couldn't help her. And she had spent all that she had trying to get better. Now, when we're sick and we're trying to get better, and it's really important to us to get better, we're looking for all the options available, right? We're willing to exhaust whatever it takes for us to get better. And so I think back about last year and, my daughter Grace and her foot, and we're trying to get this looked at. So we went to doctors in Pierre. We went to doctors in Aberdeen. We went to doctors in Sioux Falls. We went to Mayo Clinic, right? This is a big deal for her, Some of us would say, hey, it's no big deal. She can't run, so what, Whatever it is that you love, and she really enjoys running, whatever it is that you love, what if you couldn't do that anymore? Not because you got too old or anything like that, but just you should be able to do it, but you can't. Then what do? Well, God's got it under control. I'll just trust him and it'll be just good, right? I'm not hearing anything here. This is where this woman was. She's experiencing all of this here. And for her, she's in her desperation. What does it do for her? Well, in her desperation, it gave her a door of possibility. Desperation is oftentimes a door of possibility, to see what could happen. Okay, I've tried this, I tried this, and it's not working. And this is no knock on doctors, okay? We love Steve here and Britta, right? And we look to doctors. They're trying to help us. There's no knock on them. But the idea is that there's some things that even the medical professionals can't heal in our bodies, right? And so this woman here is desperate, and she's open to alternative means, okay? Some of you guys, I know you guys remember Steve McQueen, right? Some of the young ones are like, who's Steve McQueen, right? But you remember when Steve McQueen had cancer? And he was flying to Mexico to find some alternative treatments there, to try to figure out, hey, I'm trying to get better. Looking down every possibility that he could. And here's somebody who had the means. And yet he couldn't find the healing, right? So this woman here has got that desperation. And so she has this discharge of blood. And it's been for 12 years. Interesting to note that her bleeding has been for 12 years, and this guy's daughter is 12 years old. We find that out at the end of this passage. So about the same time, this has been happening to this woman as long as this guy has had his daughter there. And so we know from the Old Testament, if we look in Leviticus chapter 15, it talks about this idea of discharges and clean and unclean and all that sort of thing. And it says here that somebody in this situation would be considered unclean. And so the Jewish people believed that if somebody was unclean, you weren't supposed to be around those people who are unclean. So that if you touched somebody who was dead, you would become tainted in some way because they're unclean. So you would be unclean for at least a certain amount of time. So this woman is an outcast. She's religiously or ceremonially unclean. She's not invited into the group of things. Come and hang out with us. She can't. So for 12 years, this has been going on. At first, they probably said, well, yeah, you're sick and you can just get better and everything like that. But no, she's not getting better. And so she's not allowed to hang out, to be with other people. She's a social outcast. And so she's there, and in her mind, she's thinking here, she heard the reports about Jesus, verse 27, and came up behind him in the crowd, and she touched his garment because she believed, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And so there was a belief that sometimes, some people who had power, that the power emanated out of their clothing as well. So that if you could just touch, and we have the song, right? Touch the hem of their garment, right? That it would be healed. You would be made whole. I wonder if that's where, like, the superheroes get the idea of the capes, So all of them have, or most of them have capes, right? Except for unless you watch The Incredibles, no capes, right? No capes, because something bad could happen with that, right? But maybe that's the idea. I don't know. Anybody of you watch Doctor Strange? No? Thanks, Cody. So, some of us that are the under 40 crowd here, Marvel's, DC Comics, comic book. His cape flies around and kind of protects him and stuff. He doesn't even have to think. It has its own mind. It's a little bit different than his power emanating through that cape. That cape actually does its own thing, So anyway, I had to digress there. It's because, why do we have such a hard time connecting? Because you guys don't watch the same movies I watch. That's the problem. Anyway, here we go. So, what do you watch? I'll watch it, and then I can connect better, okay? Anyway. She believed this about his garments. If I could just touch him, I could be made well. And so, verse 29 says that, and immediately, when she touched him, immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. So it was something that she knew took place. It wasn't just, well, I touched it and I'm wondering what's going on. Boom, she felt it immediately. And Jesus, verse 30, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him. And I remember when I first read this, I thought, man, this must be like, he's got this like power, gauge there. And as soon as she touched him, it went, like that, But it's not like that. That's the way the wording is on it. But he knew before. He knew this woman was there. And he knew what was happening here. But why did he make this big confrontation-like situation here? Perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples are there in verse 31, and they say, everybody's all around you, and you want to know who touched your garments? Who didn't touch you? That's what they basically say. And Jesus is like, no, I know. And so he looked around to see who had done it. Verse 32. Verse 33, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. So when you think about why was she so secretive at first? Because she was unclean. They wouldn't even let her around. Get away from me, you're unclean. I don't want to be unclean here. You stay over there. We're here. What's happening? We want to be around Jesus. Don't you come in here, otherwise we'll all have to get away from him. And Jesus will have to get away from you as well, because you're unclean. So she's being secretive because she knows how they would normally react. And so as he looks around, he sees who had done it. She understands, he knows. He knows. The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And I think the reason Jesus did this is because he wanted her to do her confession there. He could have quietly healed her. He could have quietly taken care of her problem. Sure. But the idea is let everybody know what he's done as well, too. Not because he's an egomaniac and he wants to be famous, but as a testimony, as a witness to his power, to his compassion. And so she confesses everything. She falls down before him and told him the whole truth. And what was Jesus' response? Verse 34 is, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." No one had been calling her that lately. She was unclean. She was outcast. Even you remember in John chapter 2 when Jesus does the miracle at Cana and turns the water into wine? Do you remember what he called his mother when she came to him? Woman. He said woman. Not necessarily a negative thing, but not really affectionate necessarily either. Here he calls this girl, this woman, daughter. And so he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So Jesus is acknowledging her faith in him for what had taken place, and her desperation caused her to look at the possibility, right? See, some of us will never turn to God unless we feel desperate. We think, hey, I got this under control. I can handle my problems. Sure, everybody has problems. I can take care of my own. But see, when things go from bad to worse and keep getting progressively worser, that's terrible language, but still, our grammar anyway, progressively worse, then what do? And so for her, it caused her to say, I can turn to somebody who just might be able to help me because no one else has been able to help me. And the truth of the matter is, in the situation of our sin, there is no one else who can help us. You can go to the Power of Positive Thinking seminars. You can go and get all kinds of education. You can learn lots of skills, but nothing can deal with our sin apart from Jesus Christ. There is no remedy for it. And so he is delivering on this to her. This is what he's doing for her. This is what we need to understand for ourselves. When he says, your faith has made you well, the literal translation of that is your faith has saved you. And so this word sozo is the Greek word that means save, I save. That word there can be used for healing and deliverance. It's the idea of being saved. Paul uses that a lot in his letters there. So you see here, he says to her, your faith has made you well, has saved you. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. And this idea of peace is the idea that she's rightly related to God. Okay, that's what peace is. When we talk about peace in the scriptures here, it's this idea. It's not just that we talk about the absence of conflict. It's the idea of being in right relationship with God. So he says, go in peace and be healed of your disease. Now think about this. She's desperate. Jairus is desperate, right? His daughter is dying. And on the way, here comes this woman and touches Jesus in the crowd. And he stops and he starts to, what's going on here? Who touched me? No, somebody touched me. I know. I felt power come out of me. Who was it? Who was it? Was it you? Was it you? Right? And then she comes and confesses and tells her story. All the while, Jairus is right there. He's like, hey, I was here first. Have you ever done that? You go to the store, maybe Walmart or something like that, and you're looking for something. And so you ask somebody, oh, can you help me with this? And then they go and they're helping you. And then while they're going, somebody else comes up to them and asks them for something. You know what I'm talking about there? Or maybe another sales clerk comes up to them and asks them something, or says, hey, by the way, did you see the game last night? And they're like, yeah, I saw it. That was crazy, huh? Did you see what happened there? Yeah, what was going on in the fourth quarter there? Why did they do that? Da, da, da. And they have this little conversation, and you're waiting there like, come on, I was here first, you know? What about me? And so Jairus, it doesn't say he's like this, but he's got to be anxious. His daughter is at the brink of death. And so he's just there. It says, while Jesus is still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? So his desperation is still there, okay? Somehow or another, he's got the patience to be there, and we're not getting any words of anything being recorded. Jesus knows what's happening. He always does. While they're going on their way, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? So they're on their way there. Matthew says that the ruler told Jesus that his daughter was dead already. Come and heal her and bring her back to life again. The account we have in Mark is that as they're going on the way, she died. And his helpers in his house, people who came from his house, come and meet him along the way and tell him that his daughter is dead. I said that this point number 3, desperation can help us trust God's reliability. Okay? Desperation can help us trust God's reliability. So here's Jairus. They're on their way. Somebody comes out and says, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? And this is not a knock on them. I mean, Jesus hadn't been resurrected yet. He hadn't come back to life from the grave. So there isn't any reason necessarily for them to believe that Jesus can do something under these circumstances. Okay? But nevertheless, here's what Jesus tells him. Jesus says to him, but overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. So when we think about belief now, we're not talking about, whether something seems to be, I can understand it. It seems to be intellectually rational for me to believe this, you know? Like, for instance, if you eat a lot of fat food, you're going to get fat. Okay, that seems to go pretty much hand in hand. You can understand that. You can believe that. But this is the idea of don't fear, but trust. And so it's an active type of thing. It's not a passive sort of thing that says, I just feel this way or I don't feel this way. It's, I am going to commit myself to believing, to trusting in you. And so Jesus is telling him to do this. Jesus doesn't need him to believe in him. Jesus doesn't need Jairus to believe in him for Jesus to do the miracle of healing his daughter. He doesn't need Jairus to do that. Okay? He's encouraging him to think rightly about the situation, to understand, because Jesus wants him to get a glimpse of who he is. And this is what God wants to do with all of us. Right? When we come into worship, the whole idea is to be reminded of who God is. When we're singing the songs of praise and we're looking at the qualities and attributes of God, we are, once again, focusing on him so that we can ascribe to him, as the scriptures tell us, what he is due or deserving of. And that is his greatness, his faithfulness, his grace, his mercy, his love, his forgiveness, all of those things, right? We want to give that to God and acknowledge him for who he is. In this case here, he's letting Jairus get a glimpse of who he is in this regard. Not to think that even death is anything that can limit God. Now, this is not to say, well, hey, we don't need to worry. We just go and start killing people because God will raise them up again. That's not the idea. But we know there is a resurrection. So that as we go through life, we have this hope. And so our spectrum is not just the time of our years on this earth and saying this is what life is. We're talking about eternity, and you have to see what's happening now in light of eternity, because if we don't do that, we won't act properly in life. We will say, this is all there is. My health, my money, my ambitions, my success happening here in these 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110 years, however many years the Lord gives us here on this earth, that's the limitation of it. That's all that life is about. That's not the way it's supposed to be. That's not the way we were supposed to see that as Christians. And so we need to be reminded of that regularly, so that when things don't go the way that we think that they should all the time, that we know how we're supposed to act. We know what we're supposed to do. In this case, he tells Jairus, do not fear, only believe. They just told him that his daughter's dead. Verse 37, and he allowed no one to follow him except for Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler. Verse 38, and while they're there, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. So back in those days, they would hire people to be professional wailers. Right? Because it was a way to show the importance of the person who passed away. You want to make sure that people cry, right? Because it's a sad thing. So you go and hire people also as a way of announcing it to everybody. Wow, what's going on over in Jairus' house? Everybody's crying. Oh, they got some people crying there. Something happened. Somebody died. His daughter was sick. Maybe she's dead now. Okay, now we know that. And so they're there and they're wailing and carrying on, and there's a great commotion, it says, and Jesus comes in here and says, why are you making a commotion and weeping? Furthermore, he says, the child is not dead, but she's sleeping. And what did they do? Verse 40, right? You know, this is why I know that they're professionals, because as soon as he says this, they start laughing at him. Okay? They're not feeling sorrow and grief over this girl who's just died. They're just doing their jobs. And then he says, she's not dead, she's sleeping. What a crazy guy this guy is, right? And so they start laughing at him. And so what does Jesus do? It says here, and they laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He said, go outside. This is not for you to see. You don't get to witness this. And he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was, and taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And that's Aramaic there. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years old. There's the connection to the two stories as well. Right? She's 12 years old, and they were immediately overcome with amazement, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. So remember we were talking about Jesus, and it seems like sometimes he tells people don't say anything. Sometimes he tells people go and say something, go tell people what I've done, that sort of thing. And in this case, he says, don't tell anybody about it, but they'll know. They'll know. And it says here, he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and he told them, commanded them, it says, to give her something to eat. Why? Because she's a person. Who knows if she's been eating much lately? Give her something to eat and let everybody know that she really is alive. It's not just that she's, kind of came out of a coma, looked with one eye and went back to sleep or something like that. She's up and about. He did a full healing there for her. So seeing all of this, you see how desperation works in our lives, at least in the lives of the people here in the scriptures. And it gives us some indication as to how we're supposed to deal with things as well. Now, I said before that I'd not been in a lot of desperate situations, but I've been in a couple, right? And in those situations there, turning to God and depending upon him, it's actually the right thing is to turn to God, right? And you have no other thing to do but to depend on him, because if you've gone through exhausted every possibility already, then to rely on God is actually the only thing you can do, right? But we don't want to get to that point where we're not trusting God unless it's the only thing we can do. The idea is that we want to be active. We want to join in with what God is doing. We want to walk with him in faith, not just in the hard times, but in the everyday times as well. But when we do find that we are in those desperate times, turn to God in those desperate times. Depend upon him. Our desperation, it can lead us to humility. Our desperation can help us to see the possibilities. Our desperation can help us to trust in God's reliability. So trust him in your desperation. Depend on him.